Imagine being chained to a mill wheel, forced to grind grain for 16 hours a day until your hands bleed and your back breaks. This wasn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday for millions of people in medieval Europe. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. Medieval slavery wasn't just about captured enemies or distant lands. It was a systematic machine of human exploitation that turned neighbors into property, children into commodities, and entire populations into living tools. Today, we're diving into the horrifying truth about medieval slavery, a truth so dark that centuries later, we're still trying to forget it. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the so-called Age of Chivalry. The foundation of medieval bondage. The collapse of the Roman Empire didn't end slavery. It transformed it into something arguably worse. While Roman slavery was brutal, it was at least recognized as slavery. Medieval Europe developed a complex web of human bondage that disguised itself behind legal terminology and religious justification, creating a system so insidious that its victims often didn't even realize they were slaves. The medieval world created multiple categories of unfree people: serfs, villains, bondsmen, thralls, colony, and outright slaves. Each category represented a different level of human ownership, but all shared one common element. They were property, not people. The complexity of these categories was deliberate, designed to obscure the reality of human ownership behind layers of legal fiction. Serfdom, often portrayed as a gentler form of feudalism, was slavery by another name. Serfs were tied to the land, yes, but they were also tied to their lord's will. They could be bought, sold, traded, and inherited like livestock. The only difference was the paperwork. When a lord sold his estate, the serfs were included in the transaction like farm equipment or cattle. But the horror went deeper than simple ownership. Medieval legal codes explicitly defined serfs as property that could be divided among heirs, used as collateral for loans, and seized to pay debts. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, listed over 28,000 slaves in England alone. And this didn't include the far larger population of serfs and villains. The transformation from Roman to medieval slavery was gradual but devastating. Roman slaves could potentially earn freedom, but medieval serfs were trapped in hereditary bondage that passed from generation to generation. Children born to unfree parents automatically became property of their parents' lord, creating dynasties of human ownership that lasted centuries. The slave markets of medieval Europe. Contrary to popular belief, medieval Europe had thriving slave markets that operated with shocking openness and efficiency. Venice became one of the largest slave trading centers in the world, importing thousands of Slavic people, the very origin of the word slave, from Eastern Europe. These markets operated openly, with prices posted like any other commodity, and with the full knowledge and approval of local authorities. The economics of medieval slave markets were brutally precise. A young, healthy male slave could fetch the equivalent of several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. Women were often more expensive, particularly if they were attractive or skilled in domestic work. Children were sold at discount rates with the understanding that buyers were investing in future labor. Elderly slaves were sometimes sold in bulk lots, destined for the most dangerous work where their lives were considered expendable. The slave markets weren't hidden in dark alleys. They were central to medieval commerce and civic life. In Prague, the slave market operated in the main square, directly in front of the cathedral. In Venice, it was located near the Doge's palace, the very heart of the Republic's power. In Dublin, under Viking control, the slave market was the largest commercial center in the city. These weren't shameful secrets. They were the backbone of the medieval economy. The sophistication of these markets was remarkable. Merchants developed standardized contracts, insurance policies, and credit systems specifically for slave trading. Specialized slave merchants traveled established routes, carrying human cargo between markets with commercial efficiency. The profits from these markets were staggering. The merchant families who dominated the slave trade used their profits to finance other ventures, build palaces, and fund church construction. The wealth generated by human trafficking was instrumental in financing the medieval economy. Price lists from medieval slave markets reveal the cold calculation behind human trafficking. Slaves were categorized by age, gender, health, skills, and physical appearance. Detailed records show that blonde slaves commanded premium prices, skilled artisans were worth more than field workers, and young women suitable for household work were the most valuable of all. These markets operated with the same attention to profit margins and market efficiency as any other medieval commercial enterprise. The Viking terror machine. No discussion of medieval slavery is complete without examining the Viking raids that terrorized Europe for centuries. But the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were sophisticated slave traders who built an international network of human trafficking that operated with military precision and commercial efficiency. The Viking longships that struck fear into coastal communities weren't just war vessels. They were specifically designed slave ships. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking ships were modified to transport human cargo efficiently. Iron shackles, chains, and holding areas have been found in numerous Viking vessels. The ships had specialized compartments for holding slaves, with rings and chains bolted to the hull for restraining captives during transport. The Vikings developed efficient methods for capturing and processing slaves that were refined over generations. They would strike coastal monasteries and villages at dawn, killing the old and infirm while capturing everyone else. These raids were planned military operations with one primary goal: acquiring human property. Viking leaders studied tidal patterns, seasonal activities, and local defenses to maximize their human harvest. The logistics of Viking slave raids were remarkable. Raiding parties carried specialized equipment for restraining captives and established temporary holding camps where slaves were sorted and prepared for transport. The most valuable captives were sent to major slave markets, while others were distributed among raiders as payment. The impact of Viking slave raids on European society cannot be overstated. Entire communities lived in constant fear, with coastal regions building fortifications specifically to defend against slave raids. Some regions of Ireland and Scotland lost as much as a third of their population to Viking slave raiders. The exploitation of young laborers in medieval society. Perhaps one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval bondage was how it affected the youngest members of society. Medieval law recognized the principle of hereditary bondage. Individuals born to unfree parents were automatically considered property of their parents' owners. But the exploitation of minors went far beyond this legal inheritance of bondage. Medieval merchants actively sought out younger workers because they were easier to train, less likely to rebel, and could be shaped into obedient servants. Young people as young as 7 were regularly sold in labor markets, often by their own desperate parents. The demand for young workers was so high that specialized markets developed, with minors sorted by age, gender, and physical attributes. The Church, which claimed to protect the innocent, actively participated in this system on a massive scale. Monastery records show thousands of young people being donated as gifts to religious institutions, where they would spend their lives in unpaid labor. These individuals were called oblates, a religious term that disguised their true status as bound laborers. The Church justified this practice by claiming they were saving souls through forced labor and religious instruction. The psychological impact on young bound laborers was devastating. They were stripped of their names, languages, and cultural identities. Young people were often separated from their families immediately after acquisition to prevent emotional bonds that might interfere with their training. The goal was to break their spirits early and transform them into obedient servants who would never question their status. Parents in desperate circumstances would sell their own offspring into bondage, often believing they were providing better opportunities. Medieval contracts show parents selling their young for as little as a few pounds of silver, enough to buy food for perhaps a month. Some parents sold their offspring to pay debts, while others were forced to hand them over as payment for crimes or taxes. The training of young bound laborers was systematic and harsh. They were subjected to strict discipline designed to break their will and teach absolute obedience. They were taught specific skills but were never taught to read or write, as educated bound laborers were considered dangerous. Young bound laborers faced particular vulnerabilities within this system. They often suffered abuse from their owners, with no legal protection. The mortality rate among young laborers was horrific. Many died from malnutrition, disease, or harsh treatment before reaching adulthood. The psychological trauma was equally severe, with many developing what we would now recognize as severe mental health disorders. The horror of plantation slavery. Long before the Atlantic slave trade, medieval Europe had its own plantation system. Large estates in Eastern Europe, particularly in modern-day Poland and Germany, operated massive agricultural operations using slave labor. These plantations were death machines. Slaves were worked from dawn until dusk, fed minimal rations, and housed in conditions that would make modern prisons look luxurious. The average life expectancy of a plantation slave was less than 10 years after arrival. The plantation owners developed sophisticated methods of control. Slaves were branded like cattle, with different marks indicating their owner, their skills, and their punishment history. Runaway slaves faced horrific punishments. The lucky ones were simply killed. Medieval plantation records, preserved in monastery archives, reveal the calculating cruelty of the system. Slaves were literally treated as livestock, with detailed records of their breeding, health, and productivity. Pregnant slave women were monitored to ensure maximum offspring production. The Islamic slave trade connection. Medieval European slavery was intricately connected to the Islamic world through a vast network of slave traders. The Vikings sold their captured slaves to Muslim merchants, who then transported them to markets in North Africa and the Middle East. This connection created a triangular trade system centuries before the Atlantic slave trade. European slaves were transported south and east, while African slaves were brought north through Spain and Sicily. The profits from this trade financed the construction of castles, cathedrals, and entire cities. The port cities of Mediterranean Europe became major slave trading hubs. Genoa, Venice, and Marseille all had established slave markets where human beings were bought and sold like any other commodity. These markets operated under the protection of local authorities and with the blessing of the Church. The Church's complicity. The Catholic Church's role in medieval slavery is one of history's most shameful chapters. Despite preaching about human dignity and Christian love, the Church was one of the largest slave owners in medieval Europe. Monasteries and churches owned thousands of slaves, euphemistically called servants or workers. These slaves maintained church properties, worked church lands, and served church officials. The Church justified this by claiming they were providing spiritual guidance to the enslaved. The Church developed elaborate theological justifications for slavery. They argued that slavery was punishment for sin, that it was part of God's natural order, and that slaves were actually blessed because they were assured of spiritual salvation through their suffering. Pope Gregory I actually encouraged the enslavement of Jews, declaring that Christian masters were doing God's work by converting their Jewish slaves. This papal endorsement opened the door for centuries of religiously motivated enslavement. The crushing reality of daily life. The daily existence of medieval slaves was a nightmare of backbreaking labor, constant hunger, and perpetual fear. Slaves were awakened before dawn by the sound of bells or horns, beginning their workday in darkness and ending it long after sunset. The typical workday lasted 16 to 18 hours, with minimal breaks for food or rest. Housing for slaves was deliberately dehumanizing and designed to break their spirits. They were often kept in underground chambers, barn lofts, or purpose-built slave quarters that were little more than cells. These structures were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and lacked basic sanitation. Privacy was non-existent, and families were frequently separated to prevent bonding and potential rebellion. The diet of medieval slaves was carefully calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain productivity while minimizing costs. Slaves typically received a daily ration of bread, gruel, and occasionally vegetables, or small amounts of meat. The food was often spoiled or of poor quality, leading to malnutrition and disease. Many slaves suffered from scurvy, rickets, and other diseases caused by dietary deficiencies. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical abuse. Slaves were given numbers instead of names, were forbidden to speak their native languages, and were punished for any expression of their cultural identity. The goal was to break their spirits and transform them into obedient tools. Slaves were constantly reminded of their status through verbal abuse, physical punishment, and deliberate humiliation. Female slaves faced additional horrors that male slaves did not. They were routinely sexually abused by their owners, overseers, and other free men. Medieval law provided no protection for enslaved women. They were property to be used as their owners saw fit. Female slaves were often forced to bear children who would become the next generation of slaves, creating a cycle of hereditary bondage. The work assigned to slaves was the most dangerous and physically demanding available. Slaves worked in mines where cave-ins and toxic gases killed hundreds. They labored in fields exposed to harsh weather and dangerous tools. They built castles and cathedrals, hauling massive stones and working at dangerous heights. Medical care for slaves was minimal and focused solely on maintaining productivity. Sick slaves who could not work were often left to die. The average life expectancy of a slave was less than half that of a free person. The social isolation of slaves was complete and deliberate. They were forbidden from forming friendships or participating in religious activities. Slaves who were caught communicating faced severe punishment, including beatings, mutilation, or death. The economics of human misery. Medieval slavery was driven by cold economic calculation. Slaves were investments that needed to generate returns, and their owners approached this with business-like efficiency. Detailed accounting records from medieval estates show that slaves were valued not just for their labor, but for their reproductive potential. Female slaves were often worth more than males because they could produce more slaves. These records treat human reproduction like livestock breeding. The profitability of slavery created a self-perpetuating cycle. Slave owners reinvested their profits in acquiring more slaves, expanding their operations, and developing new methods of control. This economic engine drove the expansion of slavery throughout medieval Europe. Regional specialization developed based on slave labor. Certain areas became known for mining operations using slave labor, others for agricultural production, and still others for manufacturing. These specialized slave economies became integral to medieval trade networks, methods of control and punishment. Medieval slave owners developed sophisticated methods for controlling their human property. Physical restraints were common. Iron collars, chains, and leg irons were standard equipment on any large estate. Punishment was swift and brutal. Minor infractions resulted in whippings, beatings, or branding. More serious offenses led to mutilation, with fingers, hands, or feet being cut off as examples to others. The most severe punishment was death, often carried out publicly to terrorize other slaves. Psychological control was equally important. Slaves were deliberately isolated from their families and communities, preventing the formation of support networks that might lead to resistance. They were also kept illiterate and uninformed about the outside world. The system of informants and collaboration was extensive. Slaves were encouraged to report on each other, with rewards offered for information about escape plans or resistance activities. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that made organized resistance nearly impossible. The resistance that history forgot. Despite the overwhelming oppression, medieval slaves did resist. However, these acts of resistance have been largely erased from historical records, as the literate classes who kept records were the same people who owned slaves. Small acts of resistance were constant: work slowdowns, tool sabotage, and minor thefts. These daily acts of defiance were the slaves' way of maintaining their humanity and dignity in a dehumanizing system. Larger uprisings occurred regularly but were brutally suppressed. The peasant revolts that periodically swept across medieval Europe were often led by enslaved people fighting for their freedom. These uprisings were crushed with extreme violence, and their leaders were executed as examples. Escape attempts were common but rarely successful. The feudal system made it nearly impossible for runaway slaves to find safety, as every lord was obligated to return fugitive slaves to their owners. Those who were recaptured faced horrific punishments designed to deter others. The international network medieval slavery was not a local phenomenon, but part of an international network that spanned continents. European slaves were transported to Islamic lands, while African and Asian slaves were brought to Europe through established trade routes. This network required sophisticated logistics and financing. Slave traders developed credit systems, insurance policies, and standardized contracts that facilitated the movement of human cargo across vast distances. These systems were as advanced as any other medieval commercial enterprise. The profits from international slave trading financed major construction projects, military campaigns, and exploration expeditions. The wealth generated by human trafficking was instrumental in funding the medieval economy and supporting the lifestyle of the nobility. The legacy of forgotten suffering. The impact of medieval slavery extended far beyond its immediate victims. Entire populations were disrupted, communities were destroyed, and cultural traditions were lost forever. The demographic impact was so severe that some regions took centuries to recover. The psychological trauma of slavery was passed down through generations. Even after formal emancipation, the descendants of slaves continued to face discrimination and economic disadvantage. The social hierarchies established during the medieval period persisted for centuries. The economic structures built on slave labor created patterns of wealth concentration that shaped European society for generations. The great fortunes accumulated through slave trading became the foundation for banking dynasties and commercial empires that dominated European commerce. The deliberate erasure. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval slavery is how successfully it has been erased from popular consciousness. The romanticized image of medieval Europe as an age of chivalry and honor deliberately excludes the reality of systematic human exploitation. This erasure was not accidental but deliberate. As societies moved away from slavery, they found it convenient to forget their ancestors' participation in human trafficking. The uncomfortable truth about medieval slavery was gradually replaced with more palatable myths about feudal society. Educational systems have perpetuated this erasure by focusing on kings and battles while ignoring the lived experiences of the enslaved masses. The result is a sanitized version of history that serves the comfort of the present while dishonoring the memory of those who suffered. The continuing relevance. Understanding medieval slavery is crucial for comprehending how systems of human exploitation develop and persist. The techniques of control, the economic incentives, and the psychological mechanisms used in medieval slavery reappeared in later forms of bondage. The legal frameworks developed to justify medieval slavery provided templates for future systems of oppression. The same arguments about natural hierarchy, divine will, and economic necessity were recycled to justify subsequent forms of human exploitation. Most importantly, studying medieval slavery reveals how ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil. The merchants, farmers, and craftsmen who participated in the slave economy were not monsters. They were regular people who accepted an immoral system as normal. Conclusion. The horrifying truth about medieval slavery is not just that it existed, but that it was so thoroughly integrated into society that it seemed natural and inevitable. Millions of people lived and died in bondage, their stories lost to history, their suffering forgotten. We tell ourselves that slavery was an aberration, a deviation from human decency that we have outgrown. But the reality is that slavery was a fundamental feature of human civilization for millennia, and its legacy continues to shape our world today. The medieval period was not a romantic age of knights and castles. It was an era of systematic human exploitation on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The slaves who built the cathedrals, worked the fields, and served in the castles were not volunteers. They were property, owned and exploited by their social betters. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering acknowledged, and their humanity restored to the historical record. Only by confronting the full horror of our past can we hope to prevent its repetition in the future. The next time you see a medieval castle or cathedral, remember that it was built with slave labor. The next time you hear about the glory of medieval civilization, remember the millions who suffered and died to make that glory possible. This is the horrifying truth about medieval slavery, a truth that challenges our comfortable assumptions about the past and forces us to confront the capacity for evil that exists within human societies. It is a truth that we forget at our own peril. The question isn't whether we've truly moved beyond slavery. It's whether we're brave enough to recognize it when it appears in new forms, because the techniques of medieval slavery didn't disappear, they evolved.